Because the biographies of the other panelists are all listed on the registration website, you have access to their distinguished achievements. So I'm going to introduce them in the briefest possible way and have them take 7 minutes to make an introductory statement, after which we will have a discussion and hopefully allow questions from the floor as well. First is Thida, who is a surgeon and novelist and a large figure in the international pen movement and very well known as an activist. And so let me turn over the floor to her for 7 minutes.
Thank you, everybody. And I think it's very hard to cover what's happening right now in my country in 7 minutes, but I try my best. And first of all, I would like to focus on the governance issue. After the coup, the military, it cannot show it's qualified enough to govern the country, especially in Magui division, Sagaing division, and Chin states, of course, and then the Kachin states and the Yangon. It's not as the whole region, but especially in the city area. But at the same time, they are trying to control through the village level administrators on the ground for the majority of the country. In that case, from the revolution side, People Defense Forces are trying to focus on these local administrators, as they are precursors to send all the information to the soldiers or the military, whom to arrest, whom to kill, etc. That's why the current situation about the governance issue is pretty much in question mark, and the PDF focusing on killing this kind of the local village level administrators, naming them as the land, the informer. So in terms of the legislature, the military, since the coup, they don't care about the either initiation or the amendment of any law apart from the cybersecurity law. In that case, right now the People Defense Forces and the revolution people focusing on destroying the Myint tower, from the very beginning, since the military do the internet shutdown deliberately in the whole country, but right now focusing on this hard to govern area, they do the internet shutdown, for example, like in the KIA area of Pakan, and right now in Sakai and the part of the Chin state. But at the same time, the PDF focusing on the Myint tower, and then the Myint owned by the military, partly owned by Vietnamese business company. Then the Myint started saying about internet shutdown will smartly interfere for the sake of the information, etc. Even though the military introduced the cybersecurity law and all the kind of the whitelist introduction and etc. as soon as it took the power, But NUG has been doing quite a lot of the law enforcement, law amendment or the initiation. Then recently the NUG started the income tax law, the amendment of the income tax law, in order to have more donation, indirect donations, and from the business people, rich business people, and elite citizens. They normally don't take, but in the revolutions, through the protest, not through the any other ways, but they have the money. They can indirectly support its the revolution. So this is also very pretty much the ground situation on the legislature. And in terms of rule of law, the killing and arbitrary arrest, looting, asking for the ransoms for the arrested people or the dead bodies, the arsons on the burning the whole village, and bombing. This is going on from the military side, and they sometimes accuse the People Defense Forces as the culprit for that, even though they already have their own version of the civilian violence attackers under the name of U-SORT, something like that. But the way they look at the rule of law issue is, for example, like recently, a lady, the daughter of the high-rank military officer, has been shooted at very late night when she was driving back from somewhere, and the security forces stopped her, and she didn't stop, and she kept driving, and she was shooted to death. And in that case, the military supporters started saying that, oh, you see, our military is good enough. They don't care whoever betrayed the law. They should taking action. They never ever think this should not be done. You know, the killing to those people without knowing them, it's arbitrary killing, but the way of the concept of the military supporter on rule of law is like something like that. But at the same time, we have so much concern about for longer term problems if everybody just thinking of the armed revolution is the solution. But recently, I was so happy to learn the CDM, the civil disobedience police, they started making an announcement saying that they beg the pardons from the people for the institutional wrongdoing during the Saffron Revolution in 2007, even though they are not the real culprit or real committer of this crime, they feel the institution has a responsibility and they try to beg the burden from the people. So it's the way the revolutions group thinking on the issue of rule of law is quite promising to me in that case. And yes, the last thing is all about the resilience and the resistance. It's not just from the people, and we learning more and more people, the soldiers are defecting, and the way the revolution people resistance is more like just trying to stop the military dictatorship, not focusing on the violence for the longer run. So that will cover. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Thida. The next speaker is Myint, a professor in political science at Carlton College. He was a student leader in the 1988 uprising as a Ph.D. from Indiana, wrote a book on international treaties concerning the Mekong and the Rhine, and is a founder of the Mutual Aid Myanmar that has gathered lots of contributions to help striking public sector workers. Kotun, please.
Thank you very much, Jen, and thank you to all of you who are listening to this panel. And I will offer two broad historical related or frameworks, two broad frameworks related to or rooted in Burmese history, and then one philosophical reflection on the current crisis. So I'll start with the first one. The first one is related to China and Burma relation, and that has to go back to the end of full Sino-Burmese War at the end of 1769. So one emperor of Qin dynasty, Qianlong, decided to end the Fourth War, attempting to annex Burma. He issued a proclamation to his military leaders. In that military leaders' proclamation, this is what Qianlong said, quote, beginning the quote, "When you send the army for an attack, there should be a fewer soldiers, lightly armed. They should take advantage of the enemy's lack of readiness to just destroy their crops and kill a few and take a few prisoners. The purpose is no more than to disturb them, but not really a war of big scale." So that edict, which the Qianlong issue, still play today in terms of creating buffer zones on the Myanmar and China border, Wa ethnic groups, TNLA, and AA, which was born in KIA area, all play in that game of the end of war. But what Qianlong wanted was a permanent war in Burma, where no peace can be settled. And so today's ethnic conflict and then the march to the federal open inclusive framework is a struggle here China's posed on Burma. Wa, TNLA, and all other ethnic group that has not been explicitly saying that we support NUG. So NUG has been supported by people and so on. So that framework is pretty important here because endless war is what China wanted that is happening in Myanmar, and it is happening now. So second thing that he did was on February 6, 1770, he issued economic embargo against Burmese king. So this might be perhaps the first economic sanction imposed by a country against another country in the world history. It is certainly the first economic sanction issue in Asian continent. So in that economic sanction, his edict said, I'm going to quote him again, as for the matter of trade, the Myanmar bandits are eager to exchange with China. This is shown clearly in several letters they sent. Fortunately, I have foreseen this, and I ordered repeatedly that they could only ask for it after they submit to us. In short, no trade with China will be allowed before the arrival of their surrender letter. This method is the best way to control the foreign barbarians. So that was his edict on issue on February 6, 1770 against Burma. And so that trade practice is still useful today to understand the investment of Chinese investment in Burma, the economic influence that China is exercising in maneuvering this crisis in Myanmar. In fact, to support the first goal that they have, which is just basically Burma should never get rich, never have peace. And that is Chinese foreign policy rooted in 1770, and it is continuing today. And so those two frameworks are very important for us to understand why the coup, why Myint and military leaders are really totally relying on China at the UNSC and all other area of international affairs. So that's the first one. Second one I want to talk about is the history of state building in Burma. The history of state building in Burma need to be understood to understand why the struggle for federalism, inclusive open federalism, is so difficult. The first, the unifier of Burma is, as we know, Moderator, and then the Myint now, and then the Alampia. And these three kings' statues are erected in Naypyidaw, and now on the China-Burma border city is beginning to be built to have that three statues of these kings. What they did and what they created as a unifying Burma was a Burman ethnocentric state, legitimized by Buddhist doctrine, which are supported by the Sangha, which is more of a materialist Sangha than the spiritual and philosophical and more actually what Buddha really taught to understand the world. So that materialist Buddhist or materialist Buddhist good examples are current Thida Seattle and 969 nationalist Buddhist monks. All of them play in legitimizing the state that may outline the fourth group, which is because the three Burman empire have failed to build the Burman state. Now, main online and military leaders are attempting to build that state with 2008 constitution, and that was their document to begin unifying Myanmar Burman state, and that state failed, and by design, because the CDM participant protesters and EAOs do not want that kind of state survive or thrive in Burma. They want that state to fail. So the state failure in Burma is it by design, and society is resilient and robust against that state. And that is really good news for open and inclusive federalism into the future. We can get that into detail in our point. And the final point that I wanted to offer is the my reflection on the current violence, the violence that Thida have already spoken about generally and everywhere happening. I mean, you can imagine 7-year-old daughters being shot at on the lap of the father in Mandalay. You can imagine a poet killed and open his chest and taking out organs from him. That would be the poet Kathy from Monua. And the crimes against humanity and the scale of violence, and if you will, dirty creativity of the violence by the Myanmar military is stunning. The world is experiencing and seeing it every day happening, unpacked in Burma. So the question for political scientists especially, and maybe international lawyers especially, is there a proper violence, and is there a proper role of violence in political establishment? And I think for us international relations scholars, just war theory rooted in Hindu tradition philosophy offer some kind of route to actually imagine that there might be proper violence, and there might be legitimate violence, and there might be just war that we could consider in, especially if we are, or the world is moving toward a more inclusive, open, liberal framework of democratic world against Chinese and Russian order of centralized order. So if we want to really open up to the protect or somewhat imagine the agency and freedom of individuals around the world in the world order that is coming into the future, we might have to rethink about the way in which the utopian peace is imagined. So that's all I have to offer.
Great. Thanks, Carlton. The next speaker is David Thang Mo. He's a Ph.D. candidate in history and theological studies at the Asbury Theological Seminary in Kentucky. And by going to his website this morning, I realized that he's the author of dozens of articles on ethnic conflict, on religion, on Buddhist nationalism, and so on. Some of which I put under my belt, but it's quite an impressive reading list, and I admire what he's had to say in several panels that we've jointly participated in. David, you have 7 minutes.
Thank you so much for your kind introductions, Professor James Scott, and it's very good to see you again after sharing a panel at Yonsei University in South Korea. I will be speaking from the perspective of the ethnic and religious minority. So speaking from that, it's not possible to ignore Buddhist nationalism and all the ethnic identity or maybe even ideology conflict. So I just want to focus on that topic today. So I would like to briefly touch on the politics of religions and the origins and movement of Buddhist nationalism in our country. Buddhist nationalism is nothing new in Myanmar. It has been rooted in the British colonial period in the 19th century. But the way that Buddhist nationalism emerged is different from each department or each movement. In the British colonial period, it emerged as the anti-Western influence. I would like to prefer the word anti-Western influence instead of anti-foreign influence. If we put it anti-foreign influence, we can say that, well, now the military government is related to China and Russia and all this like that. So I prefer the word Buddhist nationalism emerged in the British colonial period as the anti-Western influence. So it was during that time that the Burma Independence Army, which the current military government always say that is the root of their movement. It was formed to fight against the British colonial period, and they always claim that is how they came to gain independence from British. So let's move to the second movement, which is slightly from the first movement. So in the post-colonial period, or what I'll call it post-independent period, the Buddhist nationalism in Myanmar emerged as the anti-Burma or maybe the anti-non-Buddhist movement, right? So, for example, UNU make a famous slogan, what he calls Myo Pada Dadana. So if you are not a Buddhist in Myanmar, you will face some discriminations. So there are at least 3 main characteristics of that Buddhist nationalism. First, political domination is very obvious. And the second is that the ethnic cultural assimilations. So the ethnic minority cultures has been assimilated to the dominant Buddhist cultures. And then the third is the religious discrimination. So if you are not a Buddhist, you will face some discriminations in many ways in Myanmar. And so what I would like to put here is that there is the concept flag and faith, right? So the Buddhist-led military government imagined the politics in Myanmar in their Buddhist way of thinking. So that is what happened. So especially in this post-independent period, what I would call it, make Buddhism great again, which has been very obvious in Myanmar. And then, of course, some of these, the military government leaders are influenced by Donald Trump's slogan, definitely, make America great again, right? So they also use make Buddhism great again because they feel that Buddhism was declined during the British colonial period. So that's how they feel. So now let's move to the third movement, what I would call it old Buddhist nationalism in the new coup. In this movement, it's slightly different from the previous two movements. In this movement, it's not just the ethnic identity conflict, but also the ideology conflict. So that means the conflict is not just between the majority Burma Buddhists and the ethnic minority group, but among the Buddhists also have some conflict, right? So that is something important to remember here. So Buddhism against Buddhism, that is obvious. And then military dictatorship against democracy movement, as well as the Burma against the Burma. So that means the conflict becomes bigger than the second one and the third one. So let me touch on these opportunities and challenges. So the rise of the new coup create the opportunity of inter-religious and inter-ethnic solidarity among these protesters. So it comes to the crisis of Rohingya. But in this current movement, people from different religions and different ethnic groups come together and share their interreligious solidarity or maybe a unity. Of course, the question is how deep that unity is. But at least we can see that the coup create the opportunity of interreligious and inter-ethnic solidarity for the democracy movement. Especially that movement is led by the Generation C or maybe the young generation. You can see in this picture. One on the left is Assassino from Kachin, and the right one is ethnically Shani, in Zamong. And so they just try to bridge their religious and ethnic divides to confront the military coup as their common enemy. This is something important to remember in this current movement. So here is my question. 8 months into the coup, what is the state of democracy movement? Earlier, Thida and Myint has covered a lot of things, and let me briefly touch on that from the perspective of the ethnic minority issue. So in my view, in these 8 months of the coup, there are two strategies that the people are using today in Myanmar. First is a non-violence. In the beginning, they protest on the street in a non-violent way, but the military government used a violent crackdown on the peaceful protesters. And then maybe sometimes in March, they start thinking about how they should themselves self-defense. So in that case, they use a violent way, and especially in Myint, where I'm from originally, they formed this PDF, People Defense Force, which has been changed to a CDF later on to make their this resistance movement unique. So that is something that we can see. So in this second strategy, we can also see that the way the current movement is also trying to go beyond Aung San Suu Kyi method of non-violence. And we don't know whether Aung San Suu Kyi might agree with that or not. That is, we don't know. But what we can say here is that the current movement is trying to go beyond Aung San Suu Kyi method of non-violence.
You have to stop soon, David.
Yes. Okay. So here, let me go here to the third point. My question is, do the ethnic minorities and ethnic majorities share the same vision? I think the answer is yes, but we still can further argue that the ethnic majority have a vision of freedom from the coup But the ethnic minority have a double visions, freedom not only from the coup, but also from the Buddhist nationalism. That is something significant. And let me move to the last point. Does Myanmar have the future of democracy? If no, why? And if yes, how? That could be, we might have different opinions, but in my view, yes, the answer is yes. But we need two movements, not only internal movement in Myanmar, but also the external movement and international communities cooperation with the international movement. In that case, I will urge the international community to recognize NUG. And second, I will urge the international community to advocate for freedom of Myanmar people in many ways. And third, to financially support the CDM strikers and IDP people. And I believe that the next speaker, US Ambassador Scot will talk a little bit more about this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Next, let me recognize Scot Marciel, a career Foreign Service officer who has spent most of his career in Southeast Asia, was ambassador to Indonesia, ambassador to Burma, and ambassador to ASEAN. Scot, you have 7 minutes.
Thanks very much. And thanks for letting me join this panel as sort of the outsider among the 4 speakers, since the other 3 obviously are from Myanmar, and I'm very clearly not, but have had the pleasure of spending some time there. I'd like to frame my comments a little bit in a big picture sort of policy way. The way I look at this situation, the Myanmar military, the Tatmadaw, as we know, ran the country from 1962 to 2010-11 before it started loosening up, allowing reforms. And in that roughly 50-year period, they ran the country about as badly as one can run a country in every respect. Obviously, there's rightly been a huge amount of focus on the conflict and human rights violations and lack of freedom and democracy. But they also managed to drive the economy into the ground while destroying or largely destroying the health system, the education system, and actually exacerbating the very ethnic conflicts, which David mentioned, that their rule was supposed to resolve. So you have that history. And then you had the period of roughly a decade when the reforms began, from when the reforms began in 2011-12 until the coup this year. And in that period, you had a lot of reform. You had significant increases in freedom. You had a near consensus on the need to move toward federal democracy. In the period I was there, 2016 to 2020, a lot of us focused, and a lot of the media attention focused on the areas of continuing disagreement and problem, the Rohingya crisis, the continuing conflict and the lack of movement on the peace process, continuing problems with lack of full freedoms and human rights, the military's continuing human rights violations, and so on. But when I look back at it now, all of those things were very real, and there's very serious challenges that the country still, was confronting and still has to confront. But in my view, there was near consensus in the country on one thing, that the country had an opportunity to move forward, and it was moving forward in fits and starts. And everybody, just about everybody, was adamant that the one thing that they did not want to see was a return to the bad old days of military rule. And so the coup on February 1st, in addition to being completely unjustified, illegitimate, you name it, it basically met instant opposition from almost the entire country. Because, of course, people didn't want to have their freedoms taken away and their democracy, flawed as it might have been, taken away. But also, I think, because people saw their hope and their opportunity for a better future being taken away. And so I think this helps explain the incredibly widespread resistance, peaceful and otherwise, to a return to military rule. This is not, some opposition movements. This is really the country of Myanmar, ethnic Burma and ethnic minorities pretty much together, united in what's in effect a national resistance against military rule that is, I view, is largely the equivalent of a occupying force, in the sense that they have no legitimacy, no popular support, no real interest in helping people live better lives. I mean, it's striking that Tatmadaw doesn't really care how much people suffer. It's almost unimaginable. I mean, they not only impose their own suffering, but weaponize COVID and take other measures that make it clear they don't give a damn about the people at all. It's all about power for them. So going forward, I don't see the resistance to the coup waning. If anything, it will increase, both again, peaceful means and non-peaceful means. The Tatmadaw, given its history, is unlikely to say, okay, well, we'll just give up. So sadly, I think that means for some time, we're going to see more suffering, more violence. And it is really important. I think people are aware. It is really important to remember and to think every day about the incredible amount of human suffering that's going on as a result of this coup throughout the country. The violence, for sure, people suffering from COVID and not being able to get adequate medical help, people being displaced, people losing their jobs, going hungry. I mean, across the board, it's just a horrific humanitarian situation. And I think it's important that the world stay very focused on that and remember this is not just a political problem. It's a problem it's a humanitarian crisis and a problem of human suffering. Going forward, looking forward a little bit further, there's been this sort of discussion or debate about whether dialogue is needed, whether dialogue is appropriate to try to resolve this problem. And it's really tricky. I think it's really important to be careful how we talk about this, because neither side is unlikely to just give up or surrender. At some point, probably there will be a need for some kind of discussions to hopefully find a way out of this. But I think what's key is that the conditions now are not ripe for that. The junta has shown no interest in discussions. I mean, they've completely ignored and blown off ASEAN efforts to mediate. They've shown no interest in this at all. And my sense is that a lot of Myanmar people are not interested in discussions at this point now. So I think the hope for me for the future, my belief is that what's needed is for more pressure on the junta, domestic pressure and international pressure, because I don't believe they're going to be able to restore stability and be able to govern the country. Okay. And I think that what's needed is intensive pressure over a long period of time so that more and more military officers understand that they have no hope of winning. And at that point, they may be willing to look for a way out and make concessions, which then could lead to the beginning of dialogue. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Scott. I wanted to add a couple of things just into the mix for the subsequent discussion. The thing that does strike me is that the Burma are now suffering a form of direct violence and oppression that the ethnic minorities have been suffering from since 1962. And it's now come, if you like, to the Burmese heartland. And I, as a political scientist, I don't know actually of another regime, another military that is so universally despised. That is, this is not a rebellion by students and cosmopolitan elites in the cities. This is a rebellion by the entire population in villages, rural villages, and ethnic minority areas. It is such a completely predatory regime that has no popular base and no popular support, that's an extraordinary situation that in the long run, this is a regime that governs by sheer repression, violence, and terror. And the interesting thing to me is that the Tamadol, because it has its own education system, its own supply chain, it has its own healthcare system, it has its own pensions, it insists that people stay on the barracks. It is probably the most insulated military that the world has seen. There may be a couple of other examples a little like it. But what's extraordinary is that you could say that the Tatmadaw does not really live in Burma. That is to say, they are so insulated. So the horrific question is that insulation insulates it to some considerable degree. How much? I don't know. From internal defections from a split in the officer corps and so on. It looks, although there are defections, there's no evidence that you're going to have a split in the military, which would lead to a situation, I think, of perhaps more radical change. So I just wanted to put that on the table. I wanted to open it both for, let's have the participants chime in with their questions. If your question is, it would be good if your question were directed to one or another of the panelists, because then we would save a good deal of time rather than having 4 people answer. So I'll leave it to Chris or to Eric to recognize members of the audience who have questions. Can we have that again?
Yes, there's a question in the chat.
Yeah, I see it. Shall I address that question?
Please.
The question is, how do you think the role of ASEAN leaders in helping the current situation in Myanmar? But I think you have within ASEAN some governments that seem extremely concerned about the situation and have been quite outspoken, and then you have others who have been less so. So ASEAN seems divided. I think you saw the early effort back in April to have this emergency meeting, and which they came up with 5 points supposedly of agreement, although the junta immediately sort of rejected them within a day or two, I believe, of the agreement. And since then, I think ASEAN struggled to find a way forward. This is really harmful for ASEAN. This makes, in addition to the suffering of the Myanmar people, Myanmar once again has returned to being a really black mark for ASEAN, as one of its members is behaving in this horrific, it's the military at least behaving in this horrific fashion. And I think ASEAN is really struggling with how to deal with it. They don't have really measures of, coercive measures to employ to pressure Myanmar that much. Their approach is normally one to try to use the sort of ASEAN family relationship to try to win trust and sort of have quiet talks and try to nudge. But I don't know that anyone's ever succeeded in quietly nudging this military, the Tatmadaw. They're not nudgeable, if that's a word. So I do think it's been a little bit disappointing. But I think it's important that the ASEAN members keep pushing, because their own organization is being undermined by what happens, as well as the stability of the region is being undermined by the junta and this coup. So I hope the ASEAN leaders will keep looking for ways to push the generals to rethink this.
Next question.
We have a question from Neutron. And then after that, there's a question in the chat. There's actually 2 questions in the chat, but they turn out to be the same person. One came via email and one into the chat. So I say we take the question from Neutron first, and then the question from the chat.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you all for your comments. I was going to type the question in the chat box, but I will state it here. My question is directed to Dr. Thida, and it has to do with why does the military or the regime, the legislature, particularly as you've described, bother with law at all? Like when killing can be arbitrary and the regime is governed by, as Professor Scott described, sheer repression, violence, and terror. Why bother with law at all? Thank you so much.
Well, the concept behind forming or recruiting the soldiers into the Myanmar Tamil itself had so many problems already. The incentives to become the military officer or the soldier is not to protect the people. That's very clear. It's just to make them having a privileged positions among the others, especially above citizens. So the concept of the Tamil and the soldiers and military officer is they are justify people to govern or to bully the citizens. That's make more clear after the coup, and after the coup, because of the economic sanctions and the other disobedience from the citizens, military itself have not much income to give enough support to its subordinates. So especially on the ground, the soldiers are hunger. And for that reason, and then the rule of law never been the issue for the military leaders. That's why they just let them do whatever the arbitrary, so much inhumane things to do. And then I think another thing is, since the February, there was no single day to get rest for the soldiers and the army men because of the either the peaceful protest or the armed struggle is going on everywhere, all over the country. This was very hard for them for the non-stop action for more than 7-8 months. In that case, they just in kind of the deep bitterness and angers, and they cannot think of the better solutions rather than making as much as forces onto the citizens to get cooling down or to get afraid of doing any more, something like that. So that one case. And another case is they all are somehow addicted to either alcohol or the drugs, the methamphetamine by themselves, the military soldiers and the military officers. That's why their inhumane activities is more or less related to. That's why we have been noticing a lot of the fighting among each other after too much drinking alcohol. The soldiers killed its military officer. That's going on. So I think and then there will be the key ongoing the impunity issue. The high-rank military officer, they never ever take any action against their subordinates whatsoever. Whatever they do, they do. That's why the ransom cases is almost like not just betraying the citizens, but also betraying itself, the Tamil itself. They never let the military officer know, but on the ground, they try to get as much as possible from the families members of the arrested revolutionists. That's how they can earn money during this kind of the despair period. This is the period of despair for them too. They cannot get rest. They need to do something else. They are also they need to feed for their family members. And whereas they can get money, their salary is not pretty much granted by the military regime too. So it's like the vicious cycle. That's, I guess.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that. The pattern of absolute predatory robbery, ransom, and so on, much of which has nothing to do with, it's just the military turned loose to make money by kidnapping people and holding their families and so on. I thought the question, however, is worth pondering, and I don't have quite the answer to it. And that's the question of why did they bother with this patina, with this fog of legality? The fact is that people were charged under Section 505.
Yes.
So what's interesting to me is that they do whatever they want to do, but they require, and it shows us the legitimacy of the rule of law at some level. They have to have this curtain in which it appears that there's a section of the legal code that they are using. They have lawyers, they have judges, they have, the whole point of a successful dictatorship today is to have the institutional facade of a democracy, including elections, judges, and legal codes, and to, under that cover, do whatever you want. But it shows us, actually, that behind all of this, there's a tremendous legitimacy of the rule of law and of democratic governance, because they have to fake it constantly. Yes, next question, the one was in the chat, I gather, Eric? I can't see.
Jim, thank you. There's a series of questions that kind of congeal around the U.S. State Department's position on violence in Myanmar. I'd like to broaden that question just a little bit so that it's not only directed to the ambassador, but is clearly on people's mind. Thun had also mentioned the idea of, is there a case of just war, right, or just violence? And so obviously the questions would like to hear what Ambassador Scot Marciel has to say about U.S. position on that, which is maybe a tall task to announce in a panel like this. But I do think the topic of violence, when it's just or not, deserves some attention by the panel. So if all of you can reflect on that briefly, I think that would be great.
Scott?
Thanks. I'll try to address it with a bit of a caveat. First, I want to stress it's former ambassador, so I am not the ambassador to Myanmar. And what I'm going to say is absolutely my personal views. It does not represent the views necessarily represent the views of the U.S. government or the State Department. I think first, it would be very difficult for the U.S. government and many other governments to come out and say, we support violence. It's just, you know, the way I look at this is that the military created this situation with the coup. And then when people tried the peaceful approach of, you know, civil disobedience and peaceful protests and so on, the military responded with horrific violence, as we know. So, you know, one can argue that people weren't really left with the option of either dialogue or peaceful protest, and so it's understandable that some people have taken other measures. I think it's quite difficult for the U.S. government or other governments, I think, to come out and say we support violence. But I think if you looked at the totality of statements from the U.S. government and the State Department, it's very clear that they place responsibility for what's happened on the military junta and are very much in support of the people and of efforts to restore, I wouldn't even say restore, efforts to move the country back onto a democratic path with a government that respects people and human rights.
Anyone else on the panel?
Well, I just want to add one point. That's why I think from the very beginning, the people of Myanmar requesting for having the R2B, the responsibility to protect in that sense. And still, I have so much concern about the transitional justice for the longer run. For that reasons, we seriously do have a presence of the kind of the third party security forces on the ground. Otherwise, there will be non-stoppable revenge conflict going on, and that will be the end of our country. For that reason, I think the trust between the current military and the people of Myanmar has already been finished. It cannot be built again. It's ever finished already. That's why we seriously do need the third-party security forces to re-establish the rule of law inside the country. Without that, I think that's why we don't want any of the governments in the war to support the violence inside. We want the international community to help us save Myanmar in terms of making the physical and literal protection for the sake of the people, the lives of the people, the properties of the people. Either way, it might be through the UN platform or anyway, but to be frank, because of this failure, a lot of our people have lost their trust in any institutions, including ASEAN and UN. This is very dangerous for the longer run.
But I wanted to add to that actual intervention by UN or foreign powers is off the table. I think we should start with that assumption. However, there are lots of things that the international community can do. One of them is to put even more pressure on the nonpartisan delivery of humanitarian aid in Burma to communities that is not just distributed by the Tatmadaw. Another thing they can do is to persuade the Thai military to give the people who are fleeing to Chiang Mai and Mae Sot a temporary protected status as political refugees so that they are not subject to arrest by the Thai military and being thrown back into Myanmar. And presumably that same thing goes for the 11,500 people who were in Mizoram and who fled to the west, many of them Chin, as David knows. So it seems to me that short of intervention, which will never happen, forcible intervention, there are a lot of things that the international community can do that have not yet been accomplished.
If I can add to the conversation, there are two questions that international community can begin to ponder on. One is considering the type and amount of violence that military is injecting on the public. And we are daily reading Facebook feed, Twitters, and all that. The question for international community within the UN Charter, Chapter 1, 6, and 7 to consider is the Myanmar military, considering that it lost the trust and the legitimacy of all types within Myanmar, is Myanmar military becoming the world's largest terrorist organization, meaning a threat to not just the domestic people, meaning citizens of Myanmar, but also the threat to the integrity of United Nations Charter that enshrines the state sovereignty. And is Myanmar military delivering or insulting state sovereignty of Myanmar and giving to another party, which would be to China? That Myanmar military might be actually now, in fact, if you listen to the several interaction between Peace Minister Aung Min under the Thein Sein administration with the Blabadang villagers, Aung Min himself admitted that Myanmar military could not override whatever China's want to do in Myanmar, meaning that they have to listen to China. So the question is that integrity of the UN Charter, integrity of the state sovereignty of Myanmar is under threat. That question needs to be, I think, at the UN Security Council level considered. Second question is in terms of the intervention and also a type of intervention that Myanmar, the international community might consider. I think we might really be critically now forced to, in the case of Myanmar, or the case of the way of violence in Myanmar by the military, is there a type of war that is just in terms of guiding the type of intervention that need to be done to protect the foundation of the world, the community, which is the individual agency and freedom. if individual agency and freedom become a dire threat, and if our freedom, if I'm pointed a gun on my forehead, I should have a just response to that person who is going to kill me, who is going to threaten my life. So with that question, I think that the extrapolating the just war theory and understanding September 7 defensive wall that NUG sort of prepare, not declare, I would say it's just preparation. They use the emergency situation just for the people to prepare for it. I think that kind of questions are becoming far more relevant for the future diplomacy and the international order, because United States may not declare that we support the violence, but United States had invaded so many countries and changed and trajectory of the history of the country. If you think about it, if you think about these within the just war theory that Obama eloquently spoke at his Nobel Peace Prize, I think these are kind of questions we need to really consider for international diplomats and scholars. If we don't, what we are doing is we're basically listening or watching that pendulum swinging between Nazi type of fascist regime to the democratic open type. And that will be the world history for maybe 5 millennia or 8 millennia to come. And that is a shame if we are learning from books and thinking about these problems and the nature of this violence that we cannot accept, even to see on the screen. That is what at stake for a lot of educational institutions and practitioners. That's where I would add to.
David, I know you've been having internet troubles. Can you hear now? And did you want to add to this conversation before we move on?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, so sorry. My internet is not stable here because in my ear it's raining. So I missed many parts of the conversation. I don't know where I should start. Just let me briefly add to the conversation about the violence and non-violence. I mean, some international community might think that the way democracy movement in Myanmar is only violent. Two ways of and violence. They feel that these two ways could be more effective to, but that could be true. But on the other hand, what we have to think is that the suffering of the civilians, people, those who do not join in this armed group, like for example, now in Myint, in my hometown, and then Thang. I mean, because of this violent fight, many civilians left their hometown. Like for example, Thang in Chin State, only 28 people stayed in their town, and the rest of the people, they just fled to jungles, and some are Miorums. And so what I can say here is that, I mean, violence could be a good way to defeat this dictatorship, but we also need to consider the suffering of those innocent people. So in that case, I really don't know how the international community could do some help more effectively. That might be my additions.
Let me just turn things over as moderator to Eric, since as Eric knows, I have to leave promptly at 1. So thank you all for coming, and I turn the moderator role over to Eric. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. So David's point there brings us to a nice transition to some of the questions in here about nonviolent responses or other diplomatic responses. There was a question from Paul Sarno about sanctions towards the MOGE, which I assume is a gas and electric or a ministry. And there's also one that follows immediately from that from Mo Tuzar about the ASEAN dialogues in the ASEAN summits in October, and about whether Biden should sit down with Min Aung Hlaing. I think we can talk about both of those together as, you know, alternative strategies that may or may not be combined with what's happening internal to Myanmar and its armed resistance in some sense. But what are some of the other possible negotiating strategies or forms of pressure that might be put on to the junta? Maybe Scott, I'll ask you to start that conversation, but again, not leave it all on your shoulders.
Thanks. I appreciate that, Eric. Again, I certainly can't speak for the U.S. government on this, on either the sanctions issue, on the attending the ASEAN meetings. But I can say in previous discussions, internal U.S. government discussions that I was a part of, some years ago on sanctions, the approach generally was to look at, what's the impact of the sanctions. In this case, the goal is clear, which is to squeeze the junta's finances. I mean, the Biden administration has made that clear through the actions it's already taken. The other side of that is, what are the negative consequences of any sanctions? And so, in some cases, you get, if you get very broad sanctions, you could be harming a lot of other people. So I would guess in the context of looking at potential MOGI sanctions, again, it's what are the positives, i.e. reducing revenue to the regime, to the junta, versus whatever costs or downsides there are of that. And I'm not privy to those conversations, so I don't know how that's going. In terms of the president's potential participation in the ASEAN meetings, I think it's really important. I don't know what the White House is thinking or what it will do, of course. I think it's important. This is not just a Myanmar issue, right? This is all of Southeast Asia, 10 countries, 600 million people. So the president's participation in those meetings is really important because of an entire region that's quite in many ways, and where I think there's a strong demand for in the region for U.S. participation. Obviously, it wouldn't be any president's first choice to sit down at a meeting that includes men online. I don't, but I think if the president does decide to participate, I think it's important not to take that as, oh, he's okay with the junta. Clearly, we're not. The United States is not okay with the junta, but it is important to look at it in the context of the overall relationship with all of Southeast Asia, not just in the Myanmar context.
I'd be interested to hear from the other panelists about the symbolic meaning of, if Biden were to sit down at the table, how would that be received among people in Myanmar, members of the NUG and other affiliated groups interested in the Myanmar situation right now, out of curiosity. Maybe we could start with Thida.
Well, I think first of all, I think the international community should accept the failure of the 5-point census regarding the ASEAN intervention. I think if we cannot recognize it, we will end up in the trap of ASEAN all the time. Even though we are the part of ASEAN, every single countries of the ASEAN cannot guarantee any democracy because they are still struggling by themselves. So for that reason, I think even though the U.S. intervention is just through the platform of the UN or by itself, to encourage more intervention through ASEAN will not work. But at the same time, I think I seriously do hope, but it's not very promising. The UN Assembly, the other countries should also seriously think about their role for the intervention, not just US, because somehow, for example, like we still do need to take account for the intervention from the China and Russia, because the people-to-people relationship through among the Myanmar and China is very, very obvious. So my concern is there are a couple of diplomatic relationships. Sometimes it's purely the G2G, and this kind of things cannot work properly because the G2G pressure will only affect on the SAC, the terminal, because it turns out to be like the current government. But what we do need is more intervention through the other platform, P2P, people to people, through the civil society organization, through the academic institution, so and so. So in that case, ASEAN is also another big challenge, because most of the ASEAN countries turn out to be the refuge area for the military families members too. So in that case, I think the pressure from the other countries, including US, towards the ASEAN countries is not to become part of the refuge palace for the military officers in terms of the legal immigration status or the other way, economic investment, something like that. So we should think about some other ways to make to pressure on the ASEAN itself. So first of all, we need to acknowledge the failure of the 5-point census. It's already gone for my eyes. So we should think about the new strategy and the solution, not just through only ASEAN. Then we should build up the more cooperative and collective solutions through more countries, not just ASEAN.
Thank you. Khotun, did you want to add to this?
I could, if I am allowed. I think what Matthew said is very eloquent in terms of how useful ASEAN would be for the United States. If the Biden administration want to sort of create another platform, we need to really reconsider, not based on that 5-point and diplomatic attempt they started out, but it has to be a different format. But from the point of view of the people inside Burma, CDM participants, the protesters themselves, and citizens themselves, they have no really big hope in terms of international intervention. They understand it, but the only thing that they want is the international community support national unity government, which is the elected government of Burma, November 8, 2020, elected government of Burma or Myanmar. And that government should be, for international community, easy to support. The UN is now underway with the UNGA. It is recently, just yesterday, it's a schedule that Ambassador Ujo Motung was about to give a speech on September 27, was set aside because the Credential Committee is dealing with sensitive political issue within the committee on the Burma question. So, I mean, it is really a shame for the UN not to be able to bravely support the elected government of Burma. And so, and also the United Nations Security Council should at least now begin to table substantive discussion and maybe take action on the economic and arms embargo, especially arms embargo against the military regime. So these framework could be discussed. If Biden wants to sort of create a new framework with ASEAN, that's the first thing the United States have to state is a baseline. The baseline is, as Ambassador Marciel have already indicated, that current military leadership may not lie, and the top SAC member has to be set aside. They need to step out of it. A new generation of military leader, if the Biden want to sort of create that framework, if ASEAN want to create that framework, but it is really for the Myanmar public, it is impossible to accept even to that level due to what Thida had eloquently stated about the level of trust to this institution. So I think we are dealing with the traditional state-centric politics that the world is used to, and here a pretty important politic that is sort of defined by the public in Burma. Never been before in the world that we are seeing such a scale of resilient, robust population that is against their own state. And so that this question was never posed on the world institution since the founding of the United Nations in 1945. United Nations need to rethink. In that rethinking process, we need to consider those kind of state sovereignty, all of the R2P, and then just war, intervention. I mean, chapter 6 and 7 are laid out for a reason. We know that, UN Charter, chapter 6 and 7. So these are all kind of elements to rethink for the international diplomatic community and also United States Department, this as a global affair that's moving forward with some sort of element that ASEAN leader might maybe listen, but hopeless. ASEAN is a very hopeless institution because Malaysia, Singapore, and Indonesia are three respectable countries in terms of the freedom of individuals. I mean, the human rights violation and all that. So right, other than that, they are not much. So that would be my 2 cents.
We have a couple more minutes left. We were planning to end at 1:15. We can go for a few minutes beyond that, but there's 2 questions that are a little bit more specific, but one of them builds from the UN discussion that we were just talking about, representation in the UN. And there's another aspect of representation about the refugees in Mizoram that's raised by Zoma Tokhang. And I wondered if you could speak to that, but maybe think a little bit more broadly about the representation issue and people who are leaving Myanmar for various purposes and what can be done to support them. And then there's another question after that that I hope we can turn to about speculations on the military logistics of the actual opposition groups. Do they have a chance? And so I'd like to talk to that. And I think we may run out of time at that point, but we'll see where we get. David, you haven't spoken since the last time. Do you want to start this one? About representation of refugees, perhaps?
I mean, India is slightly different from Myanmar. Of course, they have the federal rule. Like, for example, many Chin people fled to Mizoram, and Mizoram have their own way of making decisions to welcome them. That's good news. And I would like to express some of the Mio people, those who joined this panel. Thank you for welcoming those, especially Chin and Kachin people, for welcoming them in your home state. I really don't know, since this has more to do with this, the UN recognitions of the refugees, I really don't know whether I might have some insight. Perhaps I think Scott, Marciel might have more insights about that.
Go ahead, Scott, if you'd like to jump in.
Okay, I'm certainly not an expert on this issue, but I'd like to say 2 things. First, on the UN, I know we tend to think of the UN as some kind of independent or institution, and it is in a way. I mean, you have the Secretary General and his staff, but fundamentally, so you have UN organizations that work directly for the Secretary General, for example, managing the refugee issue and so on. But when the UN, when you talk about the General Assembly or the Security Council, it's a collection of countries. It's not when the UN Security Council or General Assembly fails to do something, it's not the UN per se, it's because a block of countries says no. And it's important to keep that in mind. On the refugee issue, I mean, generally the UN High Commissioner for Refugees and his agency will seek access to people who have fled, who are seeking asylum. It depends on the host country's willingness to let the UN interview them, and then the UN would interview them. UN experts would interview them and determine whether they have, whether they qualify for refugee status. So it's really, you know, to say it sounds a technical issue sounds so impersonal, but it's the UN individual decisions on those refugees are, you know, based on certain criteria. But the key is for the UN High Commissioner for Refugees to be granted access by whichever country is hosting. In this case, it would be Thailand and India. And so that's really where that stands. And I don't know what discussions are going on between the UN and the government of India and the government of Thailand. I'm sure there are lots of discussions happening, but I'm just not privy to them.
Well, as far as I know, the situation of the refugee status waiting either in India or Thailand is more or less directly related to the recognition of the NUG, you know. So they having asked a lot of people who are looking for the refugee status, they having asked whether they supported the NUG statement on the September 7th. And the interpretation of these statements from some agency is more or less like supporting violence. But as far as I understand, the statements by NUG on the September 7th is saying the state of emergency, that's all. This is the state of emergency, but some of the domestic and international media also interpret that as the D-Day for the armed revolution, something like that. That's why some of the international agency interpreted, and then they asked the refugee applicants saying that if you support the statements by NUG on the 7th September, are you supporting violence, something like that. So I think this is the whole ideological conflict and understanding about the struggle of our revolution by the international community. This is pretty much very important and pretty much impactful. That's why please count it, the interpretation and the reflecting on the media, not as it's the original document said. So be more, try to dig enough what's really going on and what's the meaning of the statements, and the status of the NUG should be recognized not by this statement. That's my thought.
Thank you. We just have 2 or 3 more minutes, and I'd like to end, although it may be a sobering way to end the conversation, but there is this question from Shui Win about the PDF's relative inexperience in military logistics, and this concern about its ability to prevail over the Tatmadaw. I would be interested in hearing this. After we speak about this, what I will do is then stop the recording and we can have an open conversation for those who wish to stick around for another 10 minutes after that. But maybe we can make this the final formal response to a panel discussion. Maybe Khotun, you could start with your response.
Wow. The UNHCR question, I would like to connect to this, respond to this question. If UNHCR, if they can function within EAOs and working with EAOs, if they cannot send their own personals, this is the time to actually to be brave and bold if they want to really help the situation inside internally displaced people. As David already said, the city in Chin State has only 28 residents left. Where did they go? How do we help them? Right? Of course, to the India and then other area within Myanmar as well. So with that, also the question of how do we? Can you rephrase a little bit that question? I did not read that question, Eric. If you don't mind.
Yeah, the question is basically, does the opposition group have a chance of prevailing over the Tatmadaw? It's a kind of military question in a sense to say if it turns to full violent resistance, what are the chances of winning?
Thank you. I think the conventional war, they are well prepared. The military is well prepared. And what the PDF and others are imagining, the sort of a war of attrition war, which is although what the broader sense of international economic sanctions and so on try to sort of chip away the power of the existing authoritarian Thai government. These are sort of in line with that kind of thinking. I think if they engage in such kind of war, and at the same time, if they engage with some of the low-level soldiers within the military, sort of conversation with them, and what the Chin CNF and NUG has been recently offering them some sort of reward, financial and safety for them if they want to join the public and in a peaceful CDM way. If they can empty out, which is although the intention of CDM movement, the civil servants who wanted to cripple the function of the military council and who want to actually don't see that military council's government properly working as an authoritarian government. So CDM has that intention. And so they can sort of work with PDF and the NUG can work with, which they are already beginning to. If that combined with what PDF are doing, I think it is a just war. And it is just if you are taking down the airplanes and trucks and Myint Tower, which will be used by the military to kill its own people. I mean, they are not attacking people, civilian or the military men here. They're just basically taking away, like Kachin KIA has started way back in the gasoline truck coming from China, destroying them on the road, letting the driver flee. All kinds of these kind of peaceful action that they're doing are type of war of attrition, if you will. And that kind of war and strategy well coordinated will be, I think, quite useful for making the military, especially low-level soldier, all the way to maybe regional commander level, to join the CDM and then empty out the military institution at the top, who will not change their mind at this point. And they have so much stake in their families, like Thida is saying, their future, their businesses, and so on. If NUG and PDF can orchestrate that, and with EAOs, what they were doing. So what I'm saying is a broader type of activity is needed to really win this war. That, of course, need to be detailed out. So, for instance, military soldiers who are ordered to shoot on the street, they can point it in the wrong direction, and instead of shooting people, they can shoot it to other people. And so that kind of military man's sort of their own internal resistance against their own leader's order, making sure their trucks are sort of, the wire is not working, the battery is not charged, and the gasoline is not enough to arrive from point A to point B. Military men, if they want to join CDM in such a way from inside without taking out uniform, and they can do so. And these kind of mechanisms can be implemented with the coordination of NUG, PDF strategies, and communication with these potential CDM thinking military men. So if that kind of war, if that kind of strategy can be structured, I think there's a chance of winning. If you are going out to conventional war, who knows, a flight from China with military men on the side might come. That's very sobering international relation, like the security kind of imagination I'm thinking here. It would happen. I don't mean to say it could happen or it will happen, but it is possibility there, right? So all the way to the support from China and possibly Russian military and maybe some Israeli communication equipment that are making money out of this kind of crisis in the world for a long time. These kind of things have to be really orchestrated in thinking process and structuring the war that NUG might be intending to do. I do not know exactly what they are thinking. That would be where I would leave.
Thank you. If anyone has a short final comment, I'd love to hear that, and then I'll bring it to a close, and then we'll have an informal discussion afterward. Any final comments?
Well, I think the former intention of this armed resistance is, as the military have only the language of weapons, they have no other language. For that reasons, the revolutions groups decided to make sure the military started listening to them with this armed struggle. And then the final decision will be on the table by the political leaders. That's the real intention of from the very beginning for the armed revolution, I think.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for this fascinating conversation. It's really the beginning of what I think will be a long series of conversations about these complex issues. But most importantly, I want to thank you all for joining us. And please, everyone in attendance, join me in thanking the panelists. So thank you very much.